Okay, so we're diving deep today into speaking English like, and native.
Yeah.
You've given me some really interesting sources about fluency and like just being comfortable speaking English.
Yeah.
So we really want to kind of like go through that material, highlight the stuff that's going to help people the most and really get to
Absolutely.
the point where, we can all just relax and speak without thinking too hard.
Yeah, I think that's the goal for a lot of people.
Right, exactly.
And I think that's a very achievable goal, too.
Yeah, and it's interesting because one of the things that your sources start with is how children
Oh, yeah.
learn language.
It all starts there, right?
Yeah.
Those first couple of years when kids' brains are just like sponges for language.
It's a huge growth.
Massive growth. And they're not even like consciously trying. They're
Yeah.
just focused on the sounds and being around it all the time.
So it's like total immersion
It is.
from day one.
Yeah, total immersion, and they're really focused on the sounds, like how things sound, rather than the grammar.
Right.
You think about a 5-year-old, they're able to make these complex sentences, but they haven't had any formal grammar instruction.
That's incredible.
Right.
So what can we as adults, who are trying to learn English,
Yeah.
what can we learn from that?
That's a really good question, and I think one of the big takeaways is that idea of immersion.
Okay.
Like you said, creating your own little English-speaking world as much as possible.
So like surrounding ourselves with the language.
Exactly, surrounding yourself with the language.
Right.
Listening to English music, podcasts, audiobooks,
Watching movies.
watching movies with and without subtitles.
Okay.
Reading English books, all that kind of stuff.
So it's kind of like going back to that childhood.
In a way.
Yeah.
Environment.
Recreating that environment as much as possible.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I also noticed in your sources they talk about how children aren't so worried about
Oh, yeah.
perfect grammar. They just want to communicate.
So maybe that's something we can learn from as well.
I think so. I think initially, especially, it's more important to get your message across
Right.
than to be grammatically perfect.
So fluency over accuracy,
Yeah, exactly.
especially at the beginning.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, we talked about how kids are focused on sounds. Like even before they can speak properly, they're babbling, they're making sounds.
Right.
And that's actually really important for developing pronunciation.
Interesting.
So as an adult learner, don't be afraid to practice making those English sounds, even if you're by yourself.
Okay.
You can talk to yourself, you can read aloud, you can sing along to English songs.
So it's really about like training your tongue.
It is. It's about training your tongue and your mouth to make those sounds.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So that's how we can learn from children.
Mm-hmm.
One of the next steps is obviously understanding what people are saying when they're speaking to us.
Of course. Yeah.
And your sources talk about the importance of active listening.
Yes. Active listening versus passive listening.
Right. So what's the difference?
So passive listening is when you're hearing English, but you're not really paying attention.
Okay.
It's kind of like background noise.
Like having the radio on or something?
Exactly. But active listening is when you're really focusing on what's being said.
So you're trying to understand every word.
Not necessarily every single word, but the overall message.
Yeah, okay.
And the way to do that is to listen for what are called thought groups.
Thought groups.
Yeah, these are natural clusters of words that convey a single idea.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, so instead of listening to each individual word like, I went to the store to buy some milk,
Right.
you would listen to it as, I went to the store to buy some milk.
Okay.
So you're kind of chunking the information together.
So it's almost like taking breaths in between
Yeah, exactly, like breathing in and out
as you're listening.
as you're listening to someone speak. And another tip is to focus on the content words.
Content words.
Yeah, so these are the words that carry the most meaning.
Like nouns and verbs.
Exactly, nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, those kinds of words.
Okay, and I know that your sources also talk about how native speakers link words together.
Oh yeah, this is a big one.
So they don't always pronounce every single sound.
Right, so for example, what are you often becomes whatcha,
Right. Whatcha.
or going to becomes gonna.
Gonna.
Yeah, so recognizing these kinds of sound reductions is really important for understanding native speech.
So it's almost like learning a whole secret code.
It is, in a way. It's like cracking the code of spoken English.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then in terms of like listening to different accents,
Oh, yeah.
what do your sources recommend?
So they recommend being exposed to a variety of accents, but starting with one that you find relatively easy to understand.
Okay.
So maybe like a standard American accent or a standard British accent,
Right.
and then gradually branching out from there.
And how do we get this exposure?
Well, there are so many resources available these days. You know,
Yeah.
you can watch movies and TV shows from different countries.
Yeah.
You can listen to podcasts and audiobooks narrated by people with different accents.
Right.
There are even YouTube channels and websites dedicated to teaching you about different accents.
It's incredible.
It's really amazing how much is out there.
So once we're listening and we're starting to understand, what about actually speaking?
Ah, that's the big one, right?
Like, because we can understand everything, but if we can't,
You got to be able to speak.
right.
And your guide emphasizes that speaking practice is absolutely crucial.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, there are a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
One of the simplest is just to talk to yourself in English.
Really?
Yeah, I know it sounds a little crazy.
Just like narrate your day.
Exactly. Narrate your day, describe what you're doing, think aloud in English.
So just get used to forming the words.
Yeah, just get comfortable with the sounds and the rhythm of the language. And then, of course, you want to find opportunities to speak with other people.
So like language partners?
Language partners, conversation groups, online communities.
Yeah.
Anything where you can actually practice speaking with someone else.
What about things like recording ourselves?
Oh, that's a great idea.
Does that help?
It can be really helpful because it allows you to hear yourself objectively.
Right.
You know, sometimes we think we sound a certain way, but when we actually hear ourselves recorded, it's like, oh, wow.
That's not what I thought I sounded like.
Exactly. So it can help you identify areas where you need to improve.
What?
And another great tip is to mimic native speakers.
So like listen to how they speak.
Yeah, listen to how they speak, how they pronounce words, the intonation, the rhythm,
And try to copy that.
and try to copy that as much as possible.
Yeah.
And there are other things you can do too, like reading aloud or
Right.
even role-playing different scenarios.
So anything that gets you speaking.
Exactly. Anything that gets you using the language actively.
And I know a lot of people are really worried about making mistakes,
Of course. Yeah.
but your sources talk about how mistakes are actually a good thing.
They are. They're absolutely essential for learning.
Really?
Yeah, because when you make a mistake, it means you're pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone.
Okay.
You're trying new things, and that's how you learn and grow.
So don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Exactly. Embrace them, learn from them, and keep moving forward.
All right, so we've talked about listening, we've talked about speaking. What about pronunciation?
Pronunciation. That's another big one.
Yeah, because we want to make sure that people can understand us.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, clear pronunciation is essential for effective communication.
So what are some tips for improving our pronunciation?
Well, one tip is to pay attention to individual sounds.
Okay.
You know, English has a lot of different sounds, and some of them can be tricky for non-native speakers.
Right.
So one thing you can do is to learn about phonemes.
Phonemes.
Yeah, these are like the building blocks of sound. And there's a system called this IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet,
IPA.
which is basically a code for representing all the different sounds of human speech.
So we don't necessarily need to learn the whole IPA?
No, you don't need to memorize the whole thing, but it can be helpful to consult phonetic transcriptions.
Okay.
You know, when you look up a word in the dictionary,
Right.
you'll often see a phonetic transcription next to it.
And that shows us how to pronounce it.
Exactly, and that can help you understand how the word should sound.
Okay.
And another tip is to listen to a lot of English audio,
Like podcasts?
podcasts, audiobooks, movies, TV shows,
Okay.
anything where you can hear native speakers pronouncing words clearly.
And try to imitate them.
Yes, try to imitate them as much as possible.
And in terms of like specific sounds
Yeah.
that we might find difficult,
Right.
what can we do?
So one thing you can do is to slow down
Okay.
when you're speaking. Focus on pronouncing each sound clearly.
So it's almost like exaggerating the sounds.
A little bit, yeah. And it can also be helpful to understand the physicality of pronunciation.
The physicality.
Yeah, like how you're using your mouth and your tongue to make the sounds.
Okay.
So you can look up diagrams or videos that show you the correct mouth and tongue positioning for different sounds.
Okay.
And then there are always tongue twisters,
Tongue twisters.
which are a fun way to practice.
So like, she sells seashells by the seashore.
Exactly. Those kinds of things, they can really help you get your tongue around those tricky sounds.
So that's pronunciation. And then your sources also talk about intonation.
Intonation.
Which is like the music of speech.
It is. It's the rise and fall of your voice, and it conveys a lot of meaning and emotion.
So how do we work on our intonation?
Well, the first step is to be aware of it.
Oh.
Listen to how native speakers use intonation.
Right.
Pay attention to how their voice goes up and down.
You try to imitate that.
Exactly. Try to imitate those patterns.
And are there any like common patterns?
Oh, yeah. There are definitely some common patterns. So for example, a falling tone at the end of a sentence usually indicates a statement,
Okay.
while a rising tone at the end of a sentence usually indicates a question.
So like you're asking for confirmation.
Exactly. And then there's a rising falling tone, which can be used for things like choices, lists, or doubt.
Interesting.
And then there's a flat tone, which can indicate lack of interest or boredom.
Okay.
So those are just a few examples, but there are many more.
So intonation is really important.
It is. It adds a lot of nuance and meaning to your speech.
Okay, so we've talked about pronunciation, we talked about intonation.
Yep.
What else can we do to make our English sound more natural?
Well, one thing you can do is to learn and use common English phrases.
Okay.
Things like greetings, introductions, ways to ask for help.
So like everyday expressions.
Exactly, everyday expressions that native speakers use all the time.
And how does that help?
Well, it helps you sound more fluent and natural.
Okay.
Because you're not having to think about every single word.
Right, you're just using these prefabricated phrases.
Exactly.
And then there's also the idea of thinking in English.
Yes, this is a big one.
So instead of translating in our heads,
Right?
we should try to think directly in English.
Exactly. And this can be tricky at first,
I bet.
but it gets easier with practice.
So how can we practice thinking in English?
Well, there are a few things you can do.
Yeah.
One is to label things around you in English.
So like the table, the chair,
Exactly.
the window.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you can also try to think about your day in English.
So like what you did, what you're going to do.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can also try to explain simple concepts in English.
So it's just about getting used to using the language.
Exactly. Getting your brain used to thinking in English.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So we've talked about a lot of different things today.
We have.
What are some of the key takeaways?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways is that learning to speak English like a native is a process.
Okay.
It takes time and effort, but it's definitely achievable.
Yeah.
And I think another takeaway is that it's important to focus on the right things.
So like what we've been talking about.
Exactly, like listening, speaking, pronunciation, intonation.
And not being afraid to make mistakes.
Absolutely, mistakes are part of the learning process.
Yeah. And immersing ourselves in the language.
Yes, surrounding yourself with English as much as possible.
So to wrap things up,
Mm-hmm.
What's one thing that our listeners can do today?
To improve their English,
Yeah. To take action.
I would say think about one small change you can make to your daily routine
Okay.
that will help you get more exposure to English.
So maybe let's do an English podcast.
Exactly.
Or watch an English TV show.
Yeah, or even just spend 5 minutes reading an English article online.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be a big change, but just something consistent that you can do every day.
So it's about building those habits.
Exactly, building those habits and making English a part of your everyday life.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today
It's been my pleasure.
and for sharing all of this great information.
I hope it's helpful.
I'm sure it will be.
Great.
And to our listeners, we hope you enjoy this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.